The silent depths. The ocean has always been a place of mystery, a vast, endless abyss where secrets are buried, never to see the light of day. It is an unforgiving expanse, both awe-inspiring and terrifying. For centuries, sailors and explorers have ventured into its depths, but some things should remain untouched. Sometimes, the ocean does not want to be discovered. This is a story about one such discovery, one that was never meant to be found. It was a calm evening when the crew of the Marina's Dawn set sail from the coast of New Zealand. The sky was clear, and the water shimmered in hues of deep blue and emerald. The ship was a research vessel, and the mission was simple, to gather data on the ocean floor in a newly mapped area. There was nothing unusual about the mission, and the crew had no reason to suspect that anything would go wrong. Captain Claire Jennings stood at the helm, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. She had been at sea for years and knew the ocean better than most people knew their own homes. The rest of the crew was below deck, preparing for the night shift. The ship was equipped with the latest technology, including sonar equipment that could map the ocean floor with incredible precision. They had ventured into areas where no human had set foot, and had often discovered things that were both fascinating and terrifying. But nothing could have prepared them for what lay ahead. It all started with a strange anomaly on the sonar. At first, it was nothing more than a blip, a faint, irregular pulse that flickered across the screen. The technician, a young man named Mark, assumed it was a glitch in the system. He had seen these before. But when the blip grew more pronounced, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Captain, you might want to take a look at this," Mark said over the intercom, his voice tight with unease. Claire made her way to the control room, where Mark was monitoring the sonar data. The screen showed a large, dark shape deep below them, far deeper than the surrounding ocean floor. It was almost as if something was watching them. "Is that an underwater mountain?" Claire asked, trying to rationalize the strange reading. Mark shook his head. "No, it doesn't match any known geological formations. It's something else." The crew gathered around the sonar display, their faces filled with confusion and concern. The shape on the screen was unlike anything they had ever seen. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, sending out strange vibrations that were picked up by the sonar. Claire hesitated. Something about it didn't sit right with her. "Can we get a visual?" she asked. The ship's cameras were adjusted to focus on the area, but the deep water was too dark to capture anything. The more they focused, the more the water seemed to distort, as if something was blocking the camera's view. "What are we looking at here?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," Mark replied. "But there's something down there. Something alive." Before they could react, the ship shuddered violently, throwing the crew off balance. The lights flickered, and the ship's engines sputtered, struggling to stay on course. "What's happening?" Claire shouted, gripping the console. "We've lost power to the main systems," the technician called out. "Something's pulling us down." The ocean seemed to come alive, its surface churning and roiling as though the ship had disturbed something ancient and dangerous. The crew scrambled to regain control, but the ship was caught in an invisible grip, pulled deeper and deeper into the abyss. It felt as though the ocean itself had reached up and wrapped around them, suffocating them in its cold embrace. And then, there was silence. The ship had stopped moving. The roar of the ocean outside had ceased. It was as if time had frozen. "Everyone, check in," Claire ordered, her voice sharp with authority, though she could feel the panic rising in her chest. One by one, the crew reported in, but Mark, the sonar technician, was silent. "Mark?" Claire called again, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. She turned to the others. "Where is Mark?" They searched the control room, but Mark was nowhere to be found. His chair was empty, the equipment he had been using still flickering faintly. "He's gone," one of the crew members whispered. The crew scoured the ship, but there was no trace of Mark. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, taken by the ocean itself. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, panic creeping into her voice. "Start the engines. We need to move, now." But as they tried to restart the engines, a loud, screeching noise echoed through the hull. The sound was unnatural, almost mechanical, and it made their skin crawl. "Something's down there," one of the crew members murmured, his voice trembling. "Something alive." Suddenly, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from the depths, vibrating through the ship's hull. The sound was deafening, like the growl of some ancient beast awakened from a long slumber. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. "What is that?" she screamed. And then, from the water, something huge and dark emerged, an enormous shape, something that defied explanation. It was like a giant squid, but with features that no one could recognize, long, writhing tendrils covered in scales, and eyes that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. It was as if the ocean itself had birthed this creature, a thing of pure nightmare that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. The ship's crew stared in horror as the creature drew closer, its massive form blocking out the last sliver of light. Its tentacles curled around the hull, squeezing the metal with terrifying strength. "We need to get out of here," Claire shouted. "Now!" But the creature was too strong, too fast. The ship was trapped. The last thing Claire saw before the lights went out completely was the creature's eye, a vast, unblinking orb that seemed to pierce her very soul. The marina's dawn shuddered violently as the creature's immense tentacles continued to coil around the ship, squeezing it as though it were a mere toy. The metal groaned under the strain, and the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the control room. The crew was in chaos, some screaming, some frozen in terror, others trying desperately to get to safety. But there was no escaping the inevitable. The ocean had claimed them. "Hold on!" Claire screamed, gripping the nearest console as the ship tilted at an alarming angle. "Everyone, get to the lifeboats!" But as she looked around, she realized the situation was far worse than she had feared. The ship was sinking. Fast. The water began to rush into the lower decks, flooding the corridors with terrifying speed. The crew's frantic movements only seemed to add to the chaos. Claire's mind raced as she looked for a way to save them, but there was nothing. The lifeboats were already compromised by the creature's attacks, and the ship was too damaged to escape from. "We can't outrun this thing," one of the crew members shouted, his face pale with terror. Another, a young woman named Sarah, was clutching a radio, trying to send out a distress signal, but the interference was too strong. It was as if the very waters around them were silencing their cries for help. Suddenly, the ship gave one final, horrifying lurch. A deep, sickening crack echoed through the vessel as a massive tentacle tore through the hull, ripping apart the control room wall. The cold, salty sea poured in with a deafening roar. Panic erupted. "Abandoned ship!" Claire cried, her voice hoarse with desperation. She turned to see the ocean pouring through the walls, swallowing everything in its path. She barely had time to think before the ship was ripped in half. A massive wave surged into the control room, tossing Claire and the remaining crew members into the frigid water. The ship was gone in moments, devoured by the sea. Claire struggled to stay afloat, her breath ragged as the cold engulfed her. She managed to grab hold of a floating piece of debris, her body numb from the icy water. All around her, the darkness of the ocean swallowed the remnants of the ship, and she could see nothing but the vast, empty expanse. The creature had retreated, but its presence still lingered in the water, an ominous, invisible threat. The deep, unnatural growl echoed through the depths. It was then that Claire noticed something moving in the distance, shapes, dark and fleeting, weaving through the water. Were they other survivors? Or had the ocean claimed them too? She wasn't sure, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the sea consume her like it had consumed the others. Claire pushed herself to swim, using every ounce of strength she had left, though the water seemed to pull her down with every stroke. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, and her vision blurred, but she refused to stop. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had lost all meaning. Claire had no way of knowing how long she had been floating alone in the vastness of the ocean. The stars above her seemed distant and unreachable. The only sound was the rhythm of the waves and the occasional distant cry of someone, beneath the water. And then, finally, she saw land. It was a small island, barely visible on the horizon. Claire's heart raced as she gathered her remaining strength and swam toward it, the dark water swallowing her every movement. As she neared the shore, she felt the sandy bottom beneath her feet, and with a final effort, she dragged herself onto the beach, collapsing onto the sand. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, gasping for air, the salt water still stinging her skin. Her mind swam with disorienting thoughts, each one darker than the last. What had happened out there? What had attacked them? What was it that had dragged the Marina's Dawn to its watery grave? Claire struggled to her feet, her legs shaking. She scanned the beach, looking for any signs of other survivors, but the island seemed completely deserted. There was no one, no sign of life. It was just her and the endless ocean, the same one that had tried to swallow her whole. She stumbled forward, searching for shelter, for anything that could help her survive. She needed to find food and fresh water. But as she walked deeper into the island, a strange sensation crept over her. Something was wrong. The island felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. It felt as though the very air around her was charged with a sense of dread. Claire stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear something, whispers, soft, distant voices carried on the wind. Her breath hitched. The sound of voices. She turned around, her eyes scanning the shore. But there was no one. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They sounded like names. Her name. Mark's name. The names of her crew. All of them, calling out to her from the depths of the ocean. Claire's mind raced. Was it possible that they had survived somehow? That they were out there, still alive? She turned back toward the water, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers were growing louder, more desperate, as if they were coming from the ocean itself. Suddenly, she felt a sharp, cold pressure on her ankle. Her eyes widened in terror as she looked down, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A hand, pale and lifeless, reaching up from the water, its fingers curled around her leg. Claire screamed, her voice cracking with terror, as the cold, dead hand tightened its grip on her ankle. The fingers felt like ice, and a jolt of panic surged through her body. She kicked and thrashed, desperate to free herself, but the hand only tightened its hold, dragging her toward the water. "No!" Claire screamed, her voice raw, her heart pounding in her chest. She fought with every ounce of strength left in her body, pulling her foot free from the icy grip, but it was no use. The water around her began to rise, pulling her down, inch by inch. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, almost deafening. Names were being called, familiar voices, pleading with her, beckoning her to join them in the depths. She turned, trying to see where they were coming from, but there was no one. Only the ocean, dark and relentless. But then she saw it, just beneath the surface of the water. A shadow. Something large and moving, circling her, stalking her. It was the creature, the one that had torn apart the marina's dawn, and now it was here, waiting, patient. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't escape it, not this time. The island had been a trap, a place to lure her in, to make her think she was safe. There was no escape from the ocean. The sea had claimed her, just like it had claimed Mark and the others. The hand released her ankle, but Claire didn't have time to feel relief. The water around her swirled violently, and the dark shape beneath the surface surged forward, breaking through the water with terrifying speed. The creature's massive form loomed over her, its glowing eyes staring into her soul. She could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, as though she were in the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The creature was not just an animal, it was something more, something older. It had existed long before humans ever set sail upon the oceans, and it would exist long after they were gone. Claire's heart raced as she tried to swim, but the creature was too fast. Its tentacles shot out, grabbing hold of her, pulling her beneath the surface. She fought, kicking, punching, but the grip of the creature was like iron. The water turned cold, dark, and suffocating as it dragged her deeper and deeper. Her lungs burned, her body screamed for air, but there was none. The pressure of the water crushed down on her chest. Her vision blurred, and she could feel her consciousness slipping away. It was like drowning in the deepest, darkest abyss of the ocean. The last thing she saw was the creature's eye, an endless void of malice, a black hole that swallowed all light and life. When Claire awoke, she was no longer in the ocean. The water had receded, and she found herself lying on the sand, gasping for air, her body racked with coughs. She opened her eyes, blinking in confusion. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the horizon. She sat up, disoriented. She was back on the island. But it felt different now. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive presence, as if something was watching her. Something old, something that had seen countless lives lost to the sea. The whispers were still there, louder now, echoing in her mind. Names. Faces. Voices. But they weren't just in her head. Claire turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, the shore was not empty anymore. Figures were emerging from the water, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty. The crew members, Mark, Sarah, the others, were all there, their bodies lifeless but somehow still walking, still moving. They were speaking in unison, their voices hollow and distant, calling her name. Claire! Claire, join us, in the depths. The figures moved closer, their steps slow, deliberate, as if they were drawn to her, as if they couldn't help themselves. Claire backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She was surrounded, trapped once again. And oh, she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. You're not real. You're dead. You're all dead. But they didn't stop. They just kept coming, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty and soulless. Claire's mind raced, her thoughts spinning. She had to escape. She had to survive. But how? There was nowhere to go. The island was the trap, the sea was the predator, and she was the prey. One of the figures, the face of Mark, stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her. You can't run from the ocean, Claire. It's too late. We're part of it now. All of us, Forever. Claire's breath hitched as she stumbled backward. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and the ocean began to swell once again, the waves rising higher and higher, as though the sea was reclaiming what was its own. In that moment, Claire understood the truth. The ocean wasn't just a place. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that had existed long before humans and would continue to exist long after. It was a hunter, and she was its prey. The whispers, the creature, the vanished crew, they were all part of it. All victims of the sea's endless hunger. Claire turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet sand, but the island seemed to close in around her. The ocean roared louder, the voices of the lost crew growing in volume. The creature's shadow loomed beneath the waves, following her every move. As the waves crashed over her, pulling her back into the depths, Claire screamed one final time. And then, there was silence. The island was quiet once more, its only inhabitants the whispers of the lost, carried forever on the ocean's winds. The marina's dawn was gone, swallowed whole by the abyss, its secrets now buried deep beneath the waves. And Claire was just another name, another voice lost to the ocean's endless, unforgiving depths. But the ocean is never truly quiet. And sometimes, the depths are not as silent as they seem. The forgotten abyss. The sea is often seen as a symbol of tranquility, its rhythmic waves a calming presence for those lucky enough to witness its beauty. But those who venture too far from the safety of the shore often encounter a different side of the ocean, a side that is dark, dangerous, and filled with mysteries best left untouched. The sea doesn't forget, and neither do the creatures that dwell beneath its surface. This is the story of one such forgotten place, a hidden corner of the world where the ocean hides its darkest secrets. Ethan and his crew had always been drawn to the unknown. They weren't the kind of men to sit idly by, content with the world they knew. They were adventurers, explorers who sought the thrill of discovery. So, when they heard whispers of a remote stretch of ocean, far off the beaten path, that no one had ever fully charted, they couldn't resist. The coordinates were vague, just a vague reference to a location so deep in the Pacific that it hadn't been explored in centuries. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was a place where no ship had ever returned. But for Ethan, it was an irresistible challenge. The unknown called to him, and his crew was eager to answer. They boarded the Silver Horizon, a sturdy research vessel with state-of-the-art equipment. Ethan, as captain, felt confident in his ability to navigate through the ocean's most dangerous waters. The crew, though nervous about the rumors they had heard, trusted him. After all, they had sailed to the ends of the earth together. What was one more stretch of dangerous ocean? The journey started smoothly. The weather was clear, the sea calm, and the atmosphere among the crew was one of excitement and anticipation. They followed the coordinates, moving further and further from the safety of known waters. But the deeper they sailed into the abyss, the more uneasy they felt. The ocean had a way of changing here. It wasn't like any sea they had ever known. It started with small things. The sun seemed dimmer, the water darker, as though the light of the world was slowly fading. The air grew heavier, thick with a strange, unexplainable tension. At night, the stars disappeared behind a veil of fog so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The crew began to feel as though they were being watched, as though the ocean itself was conscious of their presence. Then came the whispers. At first, it was subtle. Low murmurs that seemed to drift with the wind. Ethan dismissed it as the sound of the sea, the wind tugging at the sails. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. The crew began to exchange uneasy glances, none of them willing to speak of what they had heard. But when the sounds began to repeat their names, calling out to them in soft, mournful voices, it was impossible to ignore. It was on the fourth night that the first crew member disappeared. Jonas, the ship's engineer, was the first to go. He had been on watch, keeping an eye on the navigation equipment, when the others heard a strange noise, like something scraping against the ship's hull. The sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate. They all rushed to the deck, calling out to Jonas, but there was no response. When they reached the area where he had been working, they found his tools scattered across the floor, but no sign of him. The sea around them was eerily still, and the fog had thickened to the point where visibility was reduced to almost nothing. They searched the ship from top to bottom, but Jonas had vanished. Ethan stood on the deck, staring into the inky blackness that surrounded them, feeling an icy grip on his heart. He couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. Very wrong. Where could he have gone? One of the crew members, Michael, asked, his voice shaky. I don't know, Ethan replied, his tone grim. But I don't like this. We need to get out of here. But it was too late. The whispers had already begun again, louder this time. And this time, they were more than just voices, they were a call. A beckoning. The ocean was inviting them deeper, pulling them towards something hidden far beneath the surface. As they prepared to change course, the ship shuddered violently. The silver horizon rocked from side to side, throwing the crew off balance. Ethan gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control, but the ship seemed to have a life of its own, resisting every attempt to turn. The water around them churned, and in the distance, they saw a strange shape rising from the depths. It was massive, impossibly large, with tendrils that reached up to the sky like the arms of some ancient, monstrous god. The shape seemed to rise slowly from the depths, its form obscured by the thick fog that surrounded them. As it drew closer, Ethan felt a primal fear clawing at his chest. This was no creature of the ocean. It was something else. Something older. Steer away. Ethan shouted, but the ship refused to move. It was as though something was holding them in place, something far stronger than the ship's engines could fight against. Then, the voice came again, the whispering voices of the ocean, now clearer, more urgent. They weren't calling out to them anymore. No, now they were speaking directly to Ethan. Come closer. Join us. The depths are waiting. Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to break free, to escape, but it was futile. The tendrils wrapped around the ship, their grip like iron, pulling the vessel toward the abyss. His crew screamed, trying to fight back, but nothing worked. The ship groaned as the tentacles pulled tighter, slowly tearing it apart. God help us, Michael gasped, his face pale as he clutched the railing, but it was too late. In an instant, the silver horizon was ripped from the water, lifted by the massive tendrils, and thrown into the depths. The crew was thrown into the sea, their screams lost beneath the crashing waves. Ethan fought to stay afloat, his heart pounding as he tried to swim, but the ocean dragged him under, deeper and deeper. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was the creature, its vast eyes staring down at him. And then, the whispers came again, louder than ever, wrapping around his mind, pulling him into a nightmare he could never escape. You are ours now. When the Coast Guard arrived weeks later, they found nothing. No wreckage. No sign of the Silver Horizon or its crew. Only an unexplainable stretch of calm water, eerily still and untouched, surrounded by thick fog. And deep beneath the surface, the ocean's secrets remained safe, buried where no one could reach them. For the ocean remembers, and it never forgets. Days passed, and the mystery of the Silver Horizon and its missing crew seemed to slip into obscurity, like so many other unsolved maritime disappearances. But the ocean does not forget, and the whispers of the lost crew continue to echo in the currents, a haunting reminder of the dangers lurking in its depths. It wasn't until 3 months later, when the search for the vessel had been officially called off, that something truly terrifying happened. A fishing trawler, the Sea Mariner, was traveling through the same stretch of ocean where the silver horizon had vanished. It was a routine haul, nothing more than another day's work. The crew was experienced, and they had sailed through the waters many times before, never imagining they'd encounter anything out of the ordinary. But as the trawler ventured deeper into the fog-covered waters, a strange unease began to settle over the crew. The first sign came when they noticed an unusual shape drifting in the water. It was large, circular, and appeared to be made of metal, glistening under the weak sunlight that barely broke through the fog. At first, they thought it might be some kind of wreckage, possibly from the silver horizon, though it seemed far too intact. "Let's pull it up," said Captain Reyes, a man who'd spent most of his life on the water. "Maybe we can salvage something useful." The crew reluctantly agreed, the mystery of the object piquing their curiosity. They lowered the trawl net into the water, hauling the strange object toward the surface. As it broke through the waves, the crew could finally make out its true shape. It wasn't just metal. It was the hull of a ship, but unlike anything they had ever seen. There were no markings, no signs of identification, just smooth, featureless surfaces that seemed to glimmer with an unnatural light. The metal appeared to have been corroded by time, yet it was strangely pristine, as if it had never touched the sea at all. "What is this?" muttered one of the fishermen, his voice barely a whisper. Captain Reyes stepped forward, inspecting the object. "I've never seen a ship like this," he said. His voice was filled with confusion, but there was something else there, something darker. "It's not a wreck. It's like it was deliberately placed here." A chill ran down the crew's spines. They had heard rumors of ghost ships, those strange, unmanned vessels that occasionally appeared out of nowhere. But this was something different. Suddenly, the trawler jolted. The lights flickered and the engines sputtered to life, as if struggling to stay operational. The crew exchanged nervous glances. Something was wrong. The air grew thick, and the water around them seemed to become unnervingly still. The object, the mysterious shipwreck, was still being pulled aboard. But as it came closer to the surface, something more sinister was revealed. A dark, creeping mass began to emerge from the depths of the water, twisting and writhing like a snake in the sea. Tentacles. Massive, long, sinuous appendages that reached toward the trawler, curling and stretching with a slow, deliberate force. At first, the crew thought it was the wreckage, caught on something below. But the more they looked, the more they realized that the tentacles were moving on their own, alive, and drawing closer. "Get us out of here, now!" Captain Reyes screamed. His heart raced, and his instincts screamed at him to flee. But the ship's engines were failing, the vessel was trapped, and the creeping tendrils were pulling them in. A booming, guttural growl echoed from beneath the waves, a sound so deep that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the ship. The sea around them started to swirl, the water churning violently, rising in an unnatural storm that threatened to tear the trawler apart. As the crew scrambled, trying to reverse course, the sky above seemed to darken, the fog thickening, enveloping them completely. It felt as though the very ocean had come alive, surrounding them, trapping them. Then, the screams began. One by one, the crew was taken. The tentacles emerged from the water, wrapping around the men with terrifying speed. They screamed, their voices blending into the roar of the ocean, as they were dragged into the dark abyss below. The remaining crew members fought back, but the ocean was too powerful. Captain Reyes was the last one left. He clung desperately to the wheel, eyes wide with terror, but the ship was sinking fast. The once proud sea mariner groaned under the pressure, its hull splintering as the tentacles continued their assault, ripping the ship apart piece by piece. Just as the ship tilted, the last of the lights flickered out, leaving Captain Reyes in total darkness. He could hear the whispers now, clear and unmistakable, rising from the depths, calling his name. The voices of the crew members, and others, lost to the sea, calling out to him, drawing him in. "Join us," the voices whispered. "Come below. We are waiting for you." With one final, desperate scream, Captain Reyes was pulled under the water. His body was swallowed by the ocean, just like the others. And as the trawler sank beneath the waves, the creature's shadow passed over the surface, its eyes gleaming in the depths. The sea fell quiet once more. Weeks later, the sea mariner was found, empty, adrift in the same waters. There was no sign of its crew, and no sign of the creature that had attacked it. The only evidence of the tragedy was the faintest trace of wreckage floating in the water, fragments of wood and metal from the ship's broken hull. The authorities wrote it off as another unfortunate incident, a ship lost to the merciless sea. But the fishermen who lived along the coast, the ones who knew the ocean's whispers, spoke of something else. They said the ocean had claimed them all. And they said that every year, when the fog settled thick over those same waters, the voices of the lost crew could be heard again, whispering in the night. The ocean never forgets. And it never forgives. To this day, no one dares to venture into that stretch of water again. Some say the creature still lurks beneath the waves, waiting for its next victim. Others believe the forgotten ship, with its haunting whispers, still drifts along the current, a reminder of the depths where even the bravest dare not go. And far below, in the abyss where light cannot reach, the voices of the lost continue to call. It had been months since the disappearance of the sea mariner, and the mystery surrounding the lost crew had gradually faded from the public's memory. The fog-drenched waters were once again considered to be just another stretch of ocean, unpredictable, dangerous, but nothing beyond that. But those who lived by the coast, who understood the sea's fickle nature, knew better. They knew that the ocean never forgets, and they spoke in hushed tones about a haunting presence that still lingered in the depths. The whispers that had once called to the crew of the Silver Horizon and the Sea Mariner had not disappeared. They still echoed beneath the surface, drawing the curious and the foolish to their doom. And one man was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Tom Allen had heard the stories, of course. He had grown up near the coast, where the sea was both a source of livelihood and an ever-present danger. His father had been a fisherman, and his grandfather before him. But Tom was no superstitious man. He believed in hard facts and logic, not ghost stories or whispered warnings. When he heard about the strange disappearances in the area, about the cursed stretch of ocean, where ships vanished and crews were never heard from again, he simply chalked it up to bad luck and the unpredictability of the sea. Tom had been fishing in those waters for years, and nothing strange had ever happened to him. He wasn't going to let a few old rumors stop him from making a living. One chilly morning, Tom set out alone on his boat, the Endurance. The fog had rolled in thick, as it often did in that part of the coast. The air was cold, damp, and heavy, but Tom paid it no mind. He knew these waters better than anyone. But as the hours passed and the fog deepened, something began to feel off. The air grew colder, the water unnaturally still. There was no breeze. No waves. The ocean, usually alive with movement, was eerily quiet. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just barely audible, like the wind brushing against his ears. But as he ventured deeper into the fog, they grew louder. Faint murmurs, unintelligible voices drifting on the still air. Tom paused, glancing around, but there was no one. He had heard of this, of course, stories of the sea mariner, of the silver horizon. He had been told to turn back if he ever heard those whispers, but he was not a man to be frightened by tales. He told himself it was just the wind, just his imagination running wild. But then he saw it. A shape, dark and looming, emerged from the fog ahead. At first, Tom thought it might be another boat, perhaps one in distress. But as he drew closer, his stomach twisted in dread. The shape was not a boat, it was something much larger. It was a ship. The ship was huge, far larger than any vessel he had ever seen. Its hull was dark and smooth, the metal gleaming faintly under the mist. But there was something about it that chilled Tom to his core. It looked wrong. Its edges were jagged, unnatural, as though it didn't belong to this world. His hand hovered over the throttle, his instincts telling him to turn back, but the whispers grew louder now, echoing in his head, as though the ship itself was calling to him. "Come closer, Tom. We've been waiting for you." Tom's heart raced. He knew he should leave. He knew that the stories were true, that the ocean had taken others before him. But there was something about the ship, something compelling about it, that made him unable to turn away. As he approached, he noticed something even more disturbing. There were no lights aboard the ship. It was dark, silent, and still. But there was movement. Shadows moved across the deck, silhouettes of figures, hunched, twisted forms that glided like phantoms. Suddenly, the boat lurched. The engine sputtered and died, and Tom found himself drifting toward the massive ship. His pulse quickened. He tried to restart the engine, but nothing happened. The fog thickened, closing in around him like a shroud. "Join us, Tom. The depths are waiting. You belong with us now." His breath caught in his throat. The whispers had turned into voices, and now they were calling his name, beckoning him forward. He felt the weight of their words settle on his chest, suffocating him. There was no escape. The ship's shadow loomed closer, and in that moment, Tom realized he had already crossed the point of no return. He reached out, his hand trembling, but before he could react, something large and powerful seized his boat. A tentacle, massive, slick with brine, wrapped around the hull, lifting the boat out of the water as though it were a toy. The force of the grip nearly snapped the boat in half, and Tom was thrown into the cold, black water below. The ocean consumed him in an instant. Tom's lungs filled with icy seawater as he sank deeper and deeper into the abyss. His vision blurred as the pressure mounted, but through the dark, he saw them, figures, rising from the depths, emerging from the ship that had swallowed him whole. They were the crew of the Silver Horizon, the Sea Mariner, and many others, twisted, hollow-eyed, their faces pale and ghostly. "Welcome, Tom," they whispered in unison. "Welcome to the depths." And with that, the ocean closed over him completely. Weeks later, a search party was sent out to find Tom's boat. The Endurance was found drifting aimlessly, abandoned in the same waters where the Sea Mariner had disappeared. The crew searched for any signs of Tom, but there was nothing, only the eerie stillness of the fog, and the whispers that seemed to linger in the air. No trace of Tom was ever found. As time passed, the rumors began again. The whispers, the ghost ship, the creature that lurked beneath the surface, some still believed it to be a myth. But those who lived near the coast knew the truth. They knew that the ocean never forgets, and that sometimes, the sea claims what it wants, and once it has you, there is no escape. The ocean waits, silent and patient, for the next lost soul to join the others in its cold, dark depths. And when the fog rolls in, the whispers will always return, calling for those brave or foolish enough to listen. The siren's call. The ocean, with all its beauty and treachery, has a way of luring people into its depths. The tranquil waves can deceive even the most seasoned sailors, masking the dangers that lie just below the surface. But there are stories that speak of things in the sea that no human should ever encounter. Creatures that wait patiently, luring the unsuspecting to their doom. This is the story of one such creature, a siren. Captain Luke Wallace had seen it all. A man of the sea, he had spent most of his life navigating the waters off the coast of Greece, guiding ships through treacherous currents and violent storms. He had heard the legends, of course, the tales of sirens, seductive voices that called sailors to their deaths. But Luke had never believed in such things. He had always chalked it up to superstition, to the kind of stories that old sailors tell to scare young men. There was nothing in the ocean that couldn't be explained by nature, he thought. Nothing he couldn't handle. But that was before he encountered her. It all started with a routine cargo run. Luke and his crew had been hired to transport goods from one island to another, a journey they had made countless times. The weather was calm, the sea was calm, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But as they sailed further into the night, the atmosphere began to change. A fog rolled in, thick and suffocating. The moon disappeared behind dark clouds, casting the sea into an impenetrable blackness. The air grew colder, and the ship seemed to move slower, as if the water itself was holding them back. Captain, his first mate, Thomas, called out from the helm. "Something feels off. I can't shake this feeling." Luke glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "It's just the fog. Nothing to worry about. Keep the course steady." But Thomas wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. The rest of the crew had started to murmur nervously among themselves. They had been sailing these waters for years, and they all knew the stories. Strange things had happened here, strange things that couldn't be explained. And then it came, the sound. It started as a soft hum, almost imperceptible over the sound of the ship's creaking wood and the slapping of waves against the hull. But it grew louder, clearer, as if it was coming from somewhere deep in the ocean. At first, Luke thought it was just the wind, the water playing tricks on his ears. But then the hum became a melody, haunting and beautiful. It was like nothing he had ever heard before, a voice, sweet and enticing, weaving through the fog. The crew fell silent, straining to hear. "What is that?" Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Luke stared out into the fog, his instincts telling him to ignore the sound. But the melody was impossible to ignore. It seemed to draw them in, wrapping around them like a rope. He could feel it tugging at his mind, at his soul. "Steer clear of it," Luke said, his voice tense. "Don't listen to it. It's just a trick of the sea." But it was too late. The voice grew louder, more powerful, as though it was calling directly to them. And then, amidst the fog, something emerged. A figure, standing on the rocks just off the coast, half visible in the swirling mist. At first, Luke thought it was an illusion, a trick of the fog. But the figure grew clearer, and his breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, impossibly so. A woman, her long hair flowing like liquid silver, her skin pale as moonlight. She stood barefoot on the rocks, her eyes locked onto the ship, her lips parted as she sang. The voice that came from her was like a siren's song, sweet, melodic, and full of longing. It sent chills down Luke's spine, and before he knew it, he was leaning forward, drawn in by her beauty, by her song. "Captain, no!" Thomas shouted, grabbing Luke's arm. "She's a siren. We have to leave, now." But Luke couldn't tear his eyes away. The song filled his head, drowned out all other thoughts, and he felt a strange, irresistible pull toward her. His mind clouded with desire, with need. All he could think about was her eyes, her voice, her beauty. "Luke!" Thomas shouted again, shaking him, trying to pull him away from the edge of the deck. "She'll kill us. We have to go." But it was too late. The siren's song was too strong. The melody wrapped around Luke like chains, and before he could even comprehend what was happening, he found himself stepping toward the edge of the ship, his body moving without his control. He felt no fear, only an overwhelming need to reach her. "Captain, stop!" Thomas screamed, now grabbing him with both hands, pulling him back. But Luke was too strong. The song, the pull, was too powerful. As Luke reached the edge, he heard the crew shouting behind him, the ship rocking violently as the waters around them grew turbulent. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the siren, her voice, and the ocean that called to him. Without thinking, he leaped. The water was freezing, but it didn't matter. He felt nothing but the need to reach her, to be with her. He swam toward the rocks, the mist swirling around him, the song growing louder with every stroke. But as he neared the shore, something changed. The voice began to distort, to become darker, more sinister. The beauty faded, and in its place was something more primal, more predatory. He reached the rocks, his fingers grazing the jagged surface, and then he saw her face up close. Her eyes were no longer kind, no longer filled with longing. They were cold, empty, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice now a shrill, otherworldly sound. "You've crossed the line." Before Luke could react, the siren's true form revealed itself. Her smooth skin split, revealing sharp scales beneath. Her fingers turned to claws, and her teeth elongated into razor-sharp fangs. She lunged at him with terrifying speed, her long hair whipping like tendrils of seaweed, wrapping around him, pulling him into the depths. The last thing Luke saw before the water closed over him was her eyes, black as the void, filled with hunger. The Endurance never returned. When the search party came to look for Luke, they found the ship adrift, abandoned, with no sign of the crew. The waters were calm again, the fog gone. But on the rocks, where Luke had seen the siren, there were strange markings in the stone, ancient symbols, etched deep into the surface, as if to warn any who came near. And to this day, sailors who pass through those waters hear whispers on the wind, faint and haunting, a melody that beckons them closer. Some say it's the call of the siren, waiting for her next victim. Some say it's just the sea, with its endless mysteries and dangers. But the few who survive the encounter know the truth. The ocean does not forget. And once it calls you, there is no escape. To this day, no one has ever sailed near those cursed waters again. The song of the siren still lingers in the air, waiting for the next sailor foolish enough to listen. And in the depths of the sea, Captain Luke Wallace's soul remains, forever lost to the siren's call. The sea had taken Captain Luke Wallace, just as it had taken so many before him. But even after the Endurance vanished without a trace, the story did not end. The legends continued to grow, whispered among those who lived near the coast, passed down from generation to generation like warnings meant to protect the living from the fate that had befallen those lost to the ocean's depths. It was months later when another ship, the Althea, disappeared. The Althea had been a small, but sturdy vessel, embarking on a routine trading journey from the mainland to the islands. Its crew, a group of young men eager for adventure, were unaware of the stories of the siren that had plagued the seas for centuries. They were fresh faces, confident and brimming with excitement, as they set sail into the very waters where Luke Wallace and the Endurance had met their end. Captain Adam Brooks, a man who had heard the legends, dismissed them as nothing more than tales meant to scare children. His first mate, Marcus, however, had spent his childhood listening to the old sailors' stories, and something in his gut told him there was truth to them. Captain, Marcus spoke quietly one evening, his voice tinged with unease as the ship sailed deeper into the fog-shrouded waters. "We've been sailing too long without sight of land. It's too quiet here." Adam looked at him with a raised brow. "You're letting old stories get to you, Marcus. The sea's unpredictable, sure, but it's nothing more than that. It's just fog. We'll be out of it soon enough." Marcus wasn't convinced, but he kept his thoughts to himself. They continued onward, unaware of the fate that awaited them. As the night grew darker, the fog thickened even further. The stars were hidden behind an oppressive shroud of clouds, and the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The ship's lanterns flickered and dimmed, casting long, shifting shadows across the deck. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, a distant hum, like the sound of the wind through the rigging. But then, just as with the Endurance, the melody took shape. A soft, mournful song that seemed to rise from the water itself. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The song was too beautiful, too haunting. It seemed to speak directly to their hearts. "What is that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with an unease that had settled deep in his bones. Captain Brooks stood at the wheel, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he muttered, frowning. "But it sounds familiar." The crew strained to listen, drawn in by the siren's call, the melody that seemed to beckon them closer, whispering promises of warmth, of comfort, of rest. For a brief moment, the fog seemed to part just enough for them to glimpse something ahead, a figure, standing alone in the distance. The shape was faint at first, but it grew clearer, a woman's silhouette, standing on the edge of a jagged rock, illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Her long hair flowed like water, her eyes bright, but distant. The song grew louder, more inviting. It was irresistible. "Captain," Marcus began, his voice growing more urgent, "we need to turn the ship around. This isn't right." But it was too late. The crew was already mesmerized. The first to move was a young deckhand named Thomas, who stood near the railing, his eyes locked on the siren's figure. Without a word, he leaned over the edge, reaching toward her. His body trembled as the siren's voice pulled at him like an invisible force. "Thomas!" Marcus shouted, rushing toward him. "No! You don't understand. She's not real." But Thomas was already gone. He slipped over the edge of the ship, falling into the cold, dark water below, disappearing into the shadows of the ocean. Panic erupted. Marcus grabbed the nearest rope, trying to throw it overboard to rescue Thomas, but there was no sign of him. The ocean had swallowed him whole. The siren's laughter echoed through the fog, a haunting, melodic sound that sent a chill through every member of the crew. The ship rocked violently as the fog thickened once more, and the melody twisted into something darker, more sinister. It wasn't a call anymore, it was a command. "Get us out of here!" Captain Brooks shouted, grabbing the wheel and turning sharply. But the ship refused to move, the wind not responding to their sails, the rudder useless in their grip. The sea itself seemed to be holding them in place. Then, from the water, the tentacles appeared. Huge, slick appendages, each one long enough to coil around the entire ship. They emerged silently from the ocean, their black, slippery skin gleaming in the dim light. The crew froze, their faces drained of color. The siren's song now filled the air, louder than before, as if it was being carried by the very waves that surrounded them. Marcus turned to Captain Brooks, his face filled with terror. "We need to fight back. We need to get away." But it was too late. The ship was already being dragged toward the water, the monstrous tentacles wrapping around the hull, squeezing the wood with an almost leisurely force. Screams filled the air as the crew scrambled to escape, but there was no escape from the inevitable. The siren's song changed again, growing more guttural, more primal. It no longer whispered promises, it demanded their souls. The tentacles began to tear the ship apart, splintering the wood and pulling it under the waves. Marcus fought with every ounce of strength he had, but his body was pulled towards the railing, drawn as if by an invisible hand. The siren's glowing eyes locked onto him, and he knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. The ocean had come for them. When the search teams arrived, days later, they found nothing. No wreckage. No survivors. Only the faintest traces of the Althea, a broken fragment of wood, a piece of tattered sail, and the eerie stillness of the fog. The sea, as always, remained calm. The legends of the siren did not die with the disappearance of the Althea. In fact, they grew stronger. Sailors who passed through the fog-ridden waters spoke in hushed tones about the haunting melody that seemed to fill the air whenever they sailed too close to those cursed shores. They said that sometimes, if the wind was just right, the song could still be heard, calling from the ocean. And those who were foolish enough to listen, the ones who let their guard down, who thought it was just a trick of the sea, soon found themselves lost to the abyss. Their names, their stories, vanished beneath the waves. The siren still waits, her song still echoes, and the ocean remains her domain. No one who hears the call is ever truly free. Years passed, but the legend of the siren did not fade. It only grew. Those who lived along the coastline continued to whisper about the disappearances, the ships that never returned, the sailors whose voices could still be heard in the wind. But the world moved on, as it always does. For those not bound to the sea, it was nothing more than a ghost story, an old myth from a time when people still feared the unknown. But there was one man who had not forgotten. Dr. Samuel Greaves, a marine biologist, had dedicated his life to studying the ocean. Fascinated by its depths, its creatures, and the mysteries hidden beneath its surface, he had heard the stories like everyone else. But unlike others, Samuel did not dismiss them as superstition. He believed there was something to them. Something real. He had studied the Endurance case, the Sea Mariner, the Althea, and all the others that had vanished in the same cursed waters. He had pored over records, piecing together fragments of the past, trying to make sense of the patterns that had emerged. He had seen the same details over and over, the fog, the haunting song, the appearance of the shipwrecked sailors. There was a connection, he was sure of it. But what? When he first came across the name of the siren, the creature said to lure sailors to their deaths with her song, he couldn't ignore it. He needed to know the truth. And so, with a determination that came from years of obsession, Samuel set out to find the source of the siren's call. He rented a small research vessel, the Maris, and began his journey. His crew, a small group of seasoned sailors who knew the dangers of these waters, were hesitant to accompany him. But Samuel's resolve was unwavering. He had studied the ocean for years. Now, he would uncover its secrets. They sailed into the fog-laden stretch of water where the siren had been known to appear. As they ventured deeper into the mist, Samuel's heart raced. He had spent months preparing for this moment, But now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. The fog closed in around them, thick and suffocating, just as it had been described in every account he had read. The air grew colder, and the water was eerily still. His crew, normally so confident, now exchanged nervous glances. Samuel, however, was determined. He was close. He could feel it. And then, just as he had expected, the song began. It started as a soft hum, almost imperceptible at first. Samuel's eyes widened. There it was, exactly as the reports had described. The melody was beautiful, luring, and sweet. It cut through the stillness of the ocean like a knife, filling the air with its mournful notes. The hair on the back of Samuel's neck stood on end, but he didn't falter. This was it. The moment he had been searching for. "Captain, we need to turn back," one of the sailors shouted, his face pale. "This is the siren. She's here." But Samuel could not tear himself away. His fascination was too great, his need to understand what lay beneath the surface stronger than any fear he might have had. He had come this far, he wouldn't stop now. The melody grew louder, more insistent, as though it was calling directly to him. The fog parted just enough to reveal something in the distance, an island, jagged and black, rising from the ocean like a dark monument. At the base of the rocks, standing in the shallows, was a figure. A woman. She was stunningly beautiful, with long hair that flowed like liquid silver, her skin glowing pale in the dim light. She stood there, motionless, her eyes fixed on the boat as the song poured from her lips, the melody now more powerful than ever. "Turn the ship around, Dr. Greaves," the first mate said urgently, his voice trembling. "We can't go any closer. This is madness." But Samuel stood frozen, entranced by the siren's call. He had to see her up close. He had to know what she truly was. Without a word, he stepped toward the edge of the ship. His crew shouted for him to stop, but he ignored them. Every fiber of his being was focused on her, on the song that had enveloped him completely. His heart raced as his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him to the railing, to the very edge of the boat. "Samuel, please," his first mate cried, but it was too late. Samuel leapt over the side of the boat, plunging into the cold, dark water below. The moment he entered the sea, the song stopped. The water was frigid, far colder than he had imagined. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was the siren, and she was waiting for him. He swam toward the rocks, his movements sluggish but determined. He could see her now, standing just a few feet away, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. But as he approached her, something changed. Her smile twisted into something cruel, her eyes narrowing as she tilted her head, observing him like a predator. The air around him grew heavier, colder. The waves began to rise, dark and violent, crashing against the rocks. The siren stepped forward, her form shifting, her beauty melting away to reveal something far more terrifying. Her skin split, revealing scales beneath. Her hair writhed like serpents, and her long fingers turned into sharp claws. Her teeth, once delicate and inviting, were now jagged and dripping with venom. The siren no longer resembled the beautiful woman he had once been mesmerized by. Now, she was a monster, an ancient creature of the sea, a force of nature, more terrifying than anything Samuel had ever imagined. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, her voice now guttural and dark. "You sought the truth, but now you'll never leave." Before Samuel could react, the siren lunged, her claws sinking into his chest. The water around him turned crimson as he was dragged under, deeper and deeper into the abyss. His screams were lost in the ocean, swallowed by the vast, unyielding sea. Days later, the Maris was found, adrift and abandoned in the same waters where Samuel had vanished. The crew was nowhere to be found, their names now added to the long list of those who had fallen victim to the siren's call. No one dared to search the waters again. The siren waited, her song still echoing through the fog. And the ocean, vast and eternal, kept its secrets buried deep beneath its surface. The legend of the siren, like the sea itself, would never be forgotten. And those who listened to her call were lost forever, trapped in the depths, waiting for the next sailor to come close enough to hear her song. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.